December 26, 1943, 5:45 a.m., Cape Gloucester, New Britain. Dawn mist drifted off the jungle as Japanese Betty bombers clawed into view. Marines below braced as Navy gunners opened fire. For years, such flak bursts had been more noise than danger, but this morning the sky erupted differently. Shells timed themselves, detonating close to aluminum skins, shredding wings mid-roll. Pilots swore the Americans had filled the air with invisible mines. In truth, it was a new secret: the proximity fuse. 1st Marine Division War Diaries, 11th Marines Action Reports, NHHC VT Fuze History. Micro-hook smoke curled above Pearl Harbor, but most bombers escaped untouched. The first lesson of the Pacific War was written in the black columns of smoke over Oahu. As Japanese bombers clawed back toward the horizon on December 7, 1941, American anti-aircraft crews were left staring at ammunition crates, suddenly half empty. Dozens of guns had fired thousands of shells. The sky was noisy, frightening, and thick with bursts. Yet the attackers, more than 350 aircraft, lost only a handful to flak. For every plane destroyed, scores more flew unscathed. The numbers were damning. Post-action reports counted no more than 29 Japanese aircraft downed by all defenses, fighters, flak, and desperate rifle fire combined. Anti-aircraft fire alone accounted for just a fraction of that tally. Men who had pulled their lanyards until their ears rang and their shoulders shook now had to reckon with a painful truth. Their guns had barked loudly, but their bite was almost nothing at all. The problem wasn't courage. It was physics. U.S. naval gunners relied on mechanical time fuses, small clockwork devices that could be set to detonate a shell after a chosen interval. If the estimate was correct, the shell burst near the target. If not, the detonation went harmlessly high, short, or wide. A Japanese dive bomber attacking at 250 knots could change altitude by hundreds of feet in the few seconds a shell took to reach it. Gunners had to predict speed, angle, altitude, and future position, all within seconds. Even the best crews often had less than a 5% chance of putting an effective burst close enough to damage an aircraft. The rest of their shots simply punctuated the sky with black smoke puffs. Admiral Chester Nimitz, taking command of the battered Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor, knew at once that this imbalance could not last. If carriers and oilers were to survive the running battles ahead, something had to change. Lieutenant General Delos Emmons, given the unenviable job of organizing Hawaii's air defense in the weeks after the attack, faced the same cruel arithmetic. He could deploy more guns, he could demand more drills, but the mechanical time fuse remained the bottleneck. Fire enough shells, and luck might clip a wingtip, but it was luck, not reliability. Pearl Harbor's own logs revealed the frustration. Guns had fired thousands of rounds on December 7th. Most detonated where no Japanese aircraft had ever been. Few men on the ground realized that morning that they were staring at the death rattle of an entire era of anti-aircraft warfare. Across the Atlantic, the Royal Artillery was grappling with the same agony. London and its suburbs had been pounded by Luftwaffe bombers for over a year. The British 3.7-inch AA gun, a formidable weapon with a maximum ceiling of nearly 32,000 feet, looked fearsome on parade. In practice, it was at the mercy of mechanical fuse settings. Gun crews in the Blitz described watching their shells burst far behind or well above Heinkel and Dornier bombers that droned unbothered toward their targets. Reports to the War Office acknowledged the brutal truth. Dense fire could sometimes deter or scatter, but confirmed shoot-downs by AA guns rarely matched the noise and spectacle. Fighter aircraft remained Britain's real shield. The walls of flak were more morale theater than effective defense. Only in the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany, did anti-aircraft fire approach the scale of terror its reputation suggested. General Albert Kesselring and the Luftwaffe oversaw belts of flak so thick they became known as flak corridors. By 1943, more than 1,000 heavy guns bristled around a single city, with thousands more light weapons like the 20 PM and 37 PM spread through the fields and rooftop. Still, even this enormous investment only slowed the Allied bomber offensive. It did not stop it. Allied bomber losses over the Ruhr were often heavy, but not primarily because of accuracy. Sheer volume forced bombers into higher altitudes, denser formations, and nerve-wracking routes. Flak might wound or cripple, but it rarely delivered mass destruction in a single blow. The German 88M, the most feared gun of the war, became infamous more for its versatility as an anti-tank weapon than its actual efficiency against aircraft. Allied crews described flak bursts as terrifying, yet crews also knew the odds of a single shell ending their mission were slim compared to a fighter's guns. In contrast, American outposts in the Pacific, Wake, Midway, the Philippines, could muster only a handful of AA batteries each. Oerlikon 20mm cannons spat rounds at up to 450 per minute, but their effective range ended at barely 2,000 yards. Japanese bombers at altitude could rain destruction without much fear. Where the Ruhr glowed at night with thousands of muzzles, the Pacific was dotted with tiny sparks. Here lay the contrast. Europe built fortresses of flak, while Pacific bases fought with little more than a picket fence. Both approaches had the same fatal weakness. The mechanical fuse simply wasn't accurate enough. No matter how many guns fired, most shells burst in empty sky. This futility bred irony. Civilians and soldiers alike often felt reassured by the thunderous salvos. The black blossoms overhead looked impressive, and it was easy to imagine the enemy struggling through lethal clouds. In reality, most enemy crews shrugged off the puffs as little more than distractions. Pilots on both sides came to recognize that early war flak was far less dangerous than it appeared. They wrote of the shock, the fear, and then the realization. The noise rarely matched the damage. A Royal Air Force pilot once quipped that the only certain effect of flak was to put the smell of cordite in your nose. By 1942, it was clear that anti-aircraft gunners worldwide were locked in a losing race. The faster aircraft became, the less chance shells had to meet them at the right instant. Commanders demanded thicker barrages, more guns, more ammunition. But these multiplied costs far outpaced results. This was the irony at the heart of early war air defense. Nations poured millions of dollars and man-hours into massive anti-aircraft networks, yet the actual exchange ratio remained pathetic. A lucky hit might drop a bomber, the rest simply roared past. Unknown to most gunners sweating behind their sights, a solution was already on the horizon. Somewhere in Maryland, a handful of scientists were learning to put a brain inside each shell. A brain that would transform those harmless puffs into walls of fire. It was as if we had put a radar set into a bullet, recalled physicist Merle Tuve. The idea sounded ridiculous in 1940. How could anyone fit the power of a radio, a radar receiver, and a bomb fuse into a steel shell, spinning at thousands of revolutions per second? Worse still, how could that device survive the 20,000 Gs of acceleration when a naval gun hurled it into the sky? Most engineers shrugged. If it were possible, they reasoned, surely the Germans would already be doing it. But a small team of American scientists, led by a quiet Carnegie physicist named Merle Tuve, thought otherwise. They worked not in a sprawling military arsenal, but in converted classrooms and workshops. Their cover name was Section T, one of dozens of projects under the National Defense Research Committee. Their real assignment: build a fuse so smart it could sense an aircraft and detonate at just the right instant. No guesswork required. The order came in mid-1940, just as Europe was aflame and Britain braced under the Blitz. U.S. Navy ordnance officers had begged for something beyond the century-old mechanical clock fuse. A new project was authorized, classified at the highest level. Tuve, a physicist more accustomed to cosmic rays than cannon shells, accepted the challenge with a scientist's stubborn curiosity. If vacuum tubes could be shrunk, ruggedized, and made to switch on within microseconds, a shell could carry its own tiny radar beacon. It would broadcast a pulse, sense the reflection from an approaching aircraft, and trigger the explosive charge at just the right moment. It was a fantasy to most. To Tuve, it was an equation waiting to be solved. From the start, the obstacles seemed insurmountable. A single naval shell left the barrel with a force that shattered normal electronics. Wires snapped, tubes cracked, circuits that worked on the bench failed instantly when subjected to the hammer of gunfire. But Tuve's team refused to quit. They experimented with miniature glass vacuum tubes, thimble-sized, built to withstand enormous shocks. Every fuve required around 125 separate components, each one precise to a fraction of a millimeter. Workers soldered resistors under magnifying glasses, tested tiny capacitors, and retested until failure rates slowly dropped. By 1942, the breakthrough was real. Prototypes reached 50% reliability in live fire tests. That was enough to prove the concept. For the first time, shells burst near moving aircraft without a human having to guess the timing. The Navy's proving grounds at Dahlgren, Virginia became the crucible. There, 3-inch/50 caliber guns fired round after round across the Potomac Range. Sailors watched in disbelief as shells detonated within yards of drone aircraft. No crew had touched the fuse dials, no officer had called ranges. The shell had chosen its own moment. Captain S. Bradford Shoup, a naval liaison, championed the work. Reports went up the chain to Admiral William H.P. Blandy, the chief of the Bureau of Ordnance. Blandy grasped immediately what it meant. If production could be scaled, every ship in the fleet would gain a defensive weapon unlike anything in history. American scientists assumed the Germans would race to match them. They were only half right. German engineers did pursue radio proximity fuse designs, but their circuits couldn't survive the shock of firing. Without miniaturized, rugged vacuum tubes, their prototypes fizzled on the range. By 1943, the U.S. was fielding thousands of functional fuses, while Germany had little to show beyond laboratory sketches. The irony was sharp. Germany, the land of Hertz, Planck, and Heisenberg, lagged behind a group of American amateurs improvising in Maryland. The miracle wasn't cheap. Each fuze cost $18.25, a fortune compared to a simple contact fuze, but the logic was undeniable. One fuze that brought down a bomber was worth more than hundreds of shells that burst uselessly. As the war dragged on, the numbers would run into billions of dollars. Secrecy was so tight that few in Congress even understood what they were approving. Post-war, it became popular to claim that Germany was decades behind the U.S. in electronics. The reality was narrower. German physicists understood the principle. What they lacked was America's industrial ecosystem, factories capable of mass-producing miniature, shock-resistant vacuum tubes by the millions. Without that, their designs remained sketches. The U.S. wasn't ahead by vision, but by execution. The proximity fuse was guarded with secrecy rivaling even the Manhattan Project. Whereas nuclear research consumed vast resources, only a small elite circle knew of the fuse's existence. Reports were stamped VT or POSIT and never explained. Sailors firing the shells weren't told how they worked. Rumors spread. Some thought they contained gyroscopes, others tiny homing devices. The truth was guarded in locked safes at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. By late 1942, Section T was no longer theoretical. Shipments of test lots reached the Pacific. The Bureau of Ordnance prepared memoranda for deployment, with orders so strict that any unexploded rounds had to be recovered at all costs to prevent enemy capture. The technology was fragile, expensive, and still only partly reliable. But for commanders staring down waves of enemy aircraft, it represented something unimaginable, a way to turn every burst of flak into a genuine threat. Tuve himself, looking back years later, used words that still sounded almost impossible. It was as if we had put a radar set into a bullet. That metaphor would stick. Soldiers called them radar shells. Newspapers whispered of magic bullets. But in those early months, only a handful of men knew the secret, and they understood that, if it worked in combat, the entire air war might tilt. The Japanese dive bomber shattered mid-turn. No shell had touched it directly. The date was January 5, 1943, and the cruiser USS Helena lay at anchor near Guadalcanal. Japanese aircraft had prowled these skies for months, terrorizing supply convoys and harassing Marines dug into foxholes ashore. This time, the raiders swept in with deadly confidence. Dive bombers rolled into their plunges, pilots adjusting angles to dodge the familiar patterns of American flak. But something was different. As a D-3A valve banked hard to avoid a rising column of bursts, an explosion bloomed impossibly close. So close that aluminum tore away in sheets. The bomber tumbled into the sea, broken apart not by a direct hit, but by a shell that seemed to know exactly when to detonate. The gunners on Helena looked at each other in stunned silence. For the first time in the Pacific War, a proximity fuse had drawn blood. Helena's after-action report recorded the kill. The Japanese bomber had not been struck by the shell itself. It had been shredded by the concussive burst within a few dozen feet of its fuselage. The fuze had functioned exactly as designed. The ordnance was marked V-TIA, a code even most of the crew didn't understand. They only knew it was new, secret, and carried orders stricter than anything they'd seen. Spent shells had to be recovered if possible. No unexploded rounds were ever to be left for enemy salvage. In Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance finally had its proof. A device dismissed as fantasy in 1940 had, in less than 3 years, changed the odds. The Pacific Fleet didn't stop with Helena. By early 1943, crates of VT fuses began arriving in guarded shipments across the Solomons. At first, quantities were small, mere hundreds of rounds, rationed to key ships and defense battalions. But word spread quickly. Marine defense battalions on Guadalcanal received some of the earliest allotments. Their gunners soon learned that shells armed with the new fuse behaved nothing like the old clockwork versions. Where mechanical fuses had been little better than educated guesses, the VT fuse made bursts appear as if they were reaching for enemy wings. Logs from spring 1943 show reliability rates climbing steadily. In field combat, roughly 70–80% of the shells detonated properly, astonishing for a technology born only months before, and the results were plain in the sky. By mid-1943, the Solomons had become a brutal laboratory for the new weapon. Convoy after convoy faced Japanese Betty bombers and Zero escorts. Previously, anti-aircraft fire might claim 1 or 2 aircraft out of dozens. With VT fuses, the numbers shifted. Reports estimated that kill probabilities leapt from -2% to as high as 20% in some engagements. That wasn't perfection, but it was revolutionary. Each aircraft destroyed represented not just a tactical victory but lives saved. Marines kept alive on beaches, transports spared from fire, and carriers protected from crippling strikes. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific area, received briefings with guarded language. The weapon's name was rarely spoken. But Halsey understood its effect. For the first time, his convoys could sail with something more than prayer against determined Japanese air assaults. It was as if a gospel was finally preached to the people. For Japanese pilots, the change was almost supernatural. Diaries captured their bewilderment. One aviator, returning from a raid, wrote, "The sky itself explodes. It is no longer shells but barriers." Japanese pilots wrote that American flak seemed to follow the path of the aircraft. In truth, nothing mystical was happening. The shells were simply sensing the reflection of the planes themselves. But from the cockpit of a Zero, it felt as though the sky had turned hostile in a way it never had before. The brilliance of the fuze lay in an effective burst radius on the order of tens of feet, often cited around 70 feet. A mechanical fuse needed a shell to pass within a few feet of an aircraft to matter. The proximity fuse widened the margin. Now an aircraft that strayed within that 70-foot sphere risked crippling damage. And since the fuse didn't rely on guesswork timing, evasive maneuvers, once a pilot's best defense, were no longer guarantees of safety. For Japanese aviators trained to weave, dive, and roll through flak patterns, this was a psychological blow. Maneuvers that once saved lives now ended with explosions blossoming on their wingtips. By late 1943, hundreds of VT fuse rounds had been expended across the Solomons campaign. Marines and sailors reported results with growing confidence. At convoy briefings, officers told their men, "These shells burst near the enemy, not in the empty sky." Still, secrecy remained absolute. Crews were not told how the fuses worked. They were instructed only to trust them, conserve them, and never let an intact shell fall into enemy hands. The irony wasn't lost on some officers. Gunners who had once cursed their useless flak now whispered in awe about shells that seemed almost alive. The Japanese, too, took notice. Their operational reports showed unexplained spikes in aircraft losses, sometimes entire formations thinned before even reaching their targets. Commanders tried changing altitudes, timing attacks differently, even spreading formations more widely. None of it erased the new threat. For years, anti-aircraft fire had been background noise, a frightening spectacle but rarely decisive. Now, in the Solomons of 1943, it had become a weapon to be feared. The irony was brutal. Japan had invested heavily in pilot training, doctrine, and the spiritual resolve of its air arm, yet the tide was being turned by something invisible, something never mentioned in their textbooks. A few ounces of glass and wire, sealed inside a steel shell, rewrote the mathematics of the battlefield overnight. From Helena's first kill on January 5th to the dozens of aircraft shattered over Guadalcanal by summer, the message was clear. Anti-aircraft fire was no longer guesswork. It was a science, and one that favored the Americans. Microhook, statistics, the U.S. Navy 36 ships sunk, 368 damaged and 4,907 dead, numbers tempered by VT-fused flak. The spring of 1945 brought the deadliest gauntlet the U.S. Navy had ever faced. As Marines clawed their way onto the shores of Okinawa on April 1st, fleets offshore braced for the counterstroke. It would not be measured in shells or torpedoes, but in men turned into weapons. The Japanese called it kikusui, floating chrysanthemum. 10 times between April and June, waves of kamikaze aircraft rose from Kyushu and Formosa, bent on smashing themselves into the invasion fleet. In total, 1,902,000 sorties hurled at Task Force 58 and its supporting armadas. For the U.S. Navy, this was the ultimate test of every gun, every pilot, every ounce of resolve. Among the fleet's defenses, none mattered more than the new, still secret weapon inside its 5-inch shells, the VT fuze. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, had seen kamikazes before, at Leyte Gulf in late 1944. But Leyte was only the prelude. Okinawa lay just 340 miles from Japan's home airfields. It was close enough for massed raids, far enough that intercepting fighters couldn't stop them all. The first Kikusui struck on April 6th. Hundreds of planes came low, weaving through the radar picket line of destroyers. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58's carrier strike groups, knew the stakes. If kamikazes pierced the screen, they would find carriers stacked with aircraft, fuel, and bombs. The order was simple: throw everything into the sky. Fighters scrambled, Ehrlichans barked, Bofors stitched tracers across the clouds. But the difference now was in the bursts of the 5-inch guns. Instead of exploding too early or too late, shells detonated near the attackers. Wings snapped. Engines caught fire. Pilots who had once trusted evasive roles found explosions following them into their dive. Combat logs noted the change. In earlier battles, AA batteries often saw kamikazes slip through, even after enduring thick flak. At Okinawa, commanders reported that kamikazes were breaking apart before entering their final dives. Task Force 58 after-action summaries credited the VT fuse directly. Shells detonated within 70 feet of aircraft, close enough to shred them with steel fragments. Japanese pilots described the effect in letters and diaries. One wrote, "The black bursts walk toward us. We cannot dodge." The accuracy didn't make the sky safe. Hundreds of kamikazes still crashed into American ships. But without the fuze, losses would have been catastrophic. The irony of Okinawa was that Japan had turned to its most desperate measure: pilots trained to die at the exact moment American flak had grown most lethal. Admiral Matome Ugaki, orchestrating kamikaze operations from Kyushu, believed sacrifice would break American morale. He was wrong. Kamikazes terrified sailors, but they did not stop them, and with VT-fused shells filling the sky, the odds against those suicide planes grew steeper each week. The Americans relied on microelectronics too small to see. The Japanese relied on faith and courage. When the two met in the skies over Okinawa, physics prevailed. The campaign statistics still stagger. 10 mass Kikusue offensives. April 1945. 1,000. 902,000 kamikaze sorties. 36 ships sunk, 368 damaged. 4,907 U.S. Navy dead. 763 U.S. aircraft lost. Behind those numbers lay hundreds of individual duels. Destroyers fighting for their lives, carriers ringed in flak, radar pickets blown apart by planes that slipped through. Yet, historians agree, without VT fuses, the losses would have been far worse. One Navy estimate suggested kamikaze strikes might have doubled in effectiveness if shells had remained the old mechanical type. Instead, hundreds of attackers never reached their targets. Sailors remembered the sensory shock, the crump of 5-inch guns, the rising blossoms of black, and then the sudden blossom of flame as a kamikaze disintegrated mid-air. On carriers like Bunker Hill and Enterprise, survivors spoke of watching planes vanish in bursts so close they seemed guided. Marine AA gunners on shore batteries added their own testimony. They had watched Japanese bombers shrug off barrages earlier in the war. At Okinawa, they saw formations scatter under flak alone. Still, the reality was sobering. On May 11th, Bunker Hill took 2 kamikazes in minutes. 396 men killed. VT shells could thin the waves, but they couldn't seal the skies entirely. Captured diaries reveal how the pilots saw it. A kamikaze survivor of an April raid wrote, "I rolled and dived as trained, but the air burst before me. There was no path." For men ordered to die, fear had once been numbed by ritual and ceremony. Now it was compounded by uncertainty. They no longer trusted that their training could even deliver them to the target. Some wrote of feeling cursed, as if American shells carried spirits that could see them. In reality, what stalked them was not sorcery, but a miniature circuit of resistors, capacitors, and vacuum tubes each weighing less than an ounce. The battles over Okinawa distilled the contrast between two war philosophies. Japanese commanders, unable to replace their dwindling air force, invested in courage, turning pilots into expendable weapons. The Americans invested in electronics, shrinking radar into a shell. The results were measured in the wreckage that littered the East China Sea. The kamikaze's faith clashed with the Fuzes' science. One by one, the suicides were erased from the sky before they could fulfill their mission. After the war, some veterans and writers claimed that VT shells were 90% effective, or that they had virtually ended the kamikaze threat. The reality was harsher. Okinawa still cost the Navy 36 ships and nearly 5,000 lives. Dozens of kamikazes broke through, their flaming wreckage gouging decks and killing men by the hundreds. The VT fuse did not create an impenetrable wall. What it did was buy time. It thinned the waves, cut losses, and gave gunners a weapon that worked as advertised. In a battle where even one plane could obliterate a destroyer, that margin meant survival. By June 1945, as the last Kikusui burned out, Task Force 58 was battered but afloat. Carriers still launched sorties, battleships still bombarded the shore. The Japanese air arm, by contrast, was in ruins. Historians later argued about what saved the fleet: the radar pickets, the swarms of Hellcats overhead, or the Flak. The truth is that all three worked together. But only one represented a complete transformation from the war's early years. In 1941, Flak had been noise. In 1945, thanks to the VT fuse, it was fire. German General Alfred Jodl warned, "The Allies can now fill the air with mines." In June 1944, as Allied armies clawed their way inland from Normandy, a new menace roared across the English Channel. The Germans called it the Fieseler Phi 113. The British public knew it as the V-1 buzz bomb. Each weapon was a pilotless missile, a flying bomb driven by a pulse-jet engine that made a distinctive rasping growl. They crossed the coast at 400 imph, skimming low, and when the engine cut out, the silence meant only seconds remained before impact. Londoners learned to freeze when the buzzing stopped. At first, defenses struggled. On June 13, 1944, the first wave struck, and within days, scores of V-1S were falling on London daily. Anti-aircraft belts flung shells into the sky, but the kill rate was dismal, barely 17% in mid-June. Hundreds of missiles screamed through to their targets. It was the same old story. Mechanical fuses couldn't be set accurately enough. Time-day bursts scattered uselessly in the air, while V-1S thundered past. Into this bleak arithmetic came the new weapon, the VT fuze. For secrecy, British crews were told they were loading pose-it rounds. They didn't need to know how it worked. They only needed to see the results. By late July, entire belts of guns around London and the south coast had been rearmed. The effect was immediate. Within weeks, the kill rate climbed above 50%. By late August, records show an astonishing 74% average kill rate, with one day peaking at 82%. Where once only a handful of V-1S were destroyed, now most never reached their targets. London still suffered, but the scale of devastation was contained. The contrast was undeniable. In June, the missiles had come almost unopposed. By August, the sky itself seemed to swat them down. Air Marshal Roderick Hill, commanding RAF Fighter Command, later admitted the turnaround owed more to the fuze than to fighters. Pilots in Tempests and Spitfires still tipped some missiles' wings to crash them, but the bulk of kills came from the new, smart shells. German planners were stunned. They had counted on the V-1 as a terror weapon that might paralyze Britain's war effort. Instead, General Alfred Jodl warned colleagues that Allied air defenses had grown so potent it was as if the sky itself is filled with mines. German intelligence officers noted the sudden improvement in Allied flak accuracy but could not identify the cause. Some speculated about advanced fire control radar, others about homing devices. None guessed the truth. A tiny circuit inside the shells themselves. Even as the V1 campaign waned, the VT fuse crossed into another theater, the snows of Belgium. In December 1944, Hitler launched his last great gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, better remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. Here the Allies faced a different problem. Instead of pilotless bombs, low-level Luftwaffe fighter bombers prowled over front lines, strafing columns and attacking artillery positions. On December 16th, as German tanks punched westward, the U.S. First Army rushed to deploy its new shells. Orders from Supreme Headquarters had previously banned use of the VT fuse over land for fear that dud rounds might fall into enemy hands. But with the offensive threatening to split the front, the restriction was lifted. For the first time, the POZZ fuse would be fired in Europe against live aircraft. Over snow-dusted forests, American gunners loaded their 90 mm and 105 mm guns with the new rounds. Engagement altitudes ranged from 1,000 to 5,000 feet, the perfect bracket for low-flying Luftwaffe fighters. The results mirrored London. Luftwaffe pilots who once relied on treetop maneuvers suddenly found themselves engulfed by bursts that tracked their paths. One German aviator, Karl Bohr, later remarked, "We came low. Then their shells reached us without touching us." The U.S. First Army logs recorded hundreds of VT rounds fired in the first days. By some estimates, on the order of hundreds of thousands of VT rounds were allocated during the Ardennes campaign. The Luftwaffe's already weakened formations suffered heavily. In December alone, German losses were estimated at 250–350 aircraft, depending on the source. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, received reports within days. Anti-aircraft units that had previously served as little more than deterrents now became true force multipliers. VT fuses not only broke up air attacks, but also boosted morale among ground troops, who watched with relief as enemy planes fell in bursts before they could strafe columns. For Eisenhower, who faced the nightmare of German armor surging westward, any margin mattered. The POVIT fuze had delivered one more tool to blunt the offensive. The Ardennes revealed a stark contrast. German doctrine emphasized low-level fighter bombing runs, banking on speed and terrain to outwit AA fire. The Allies countered not with more guns but with smarter ones. Flak belts around convoys and divisions became bubbles of invisible danger. To Luftwaffe veterans, it seemed as if their tactics had been nullified overnight. The very maneuvers that once guaranteed survival now carried them directly into bursts of steel. By late 1944, Germany's strategic position was collapsing. Fuel shortages crippled operations. Pilot training had shrunk to a fraction of pre-war levels. The V1 had failed to alter Britain's resolve. The Ardennes offensive, meant to split the Allies, had instead bled the Wehrmacht white. The irony was sharp. The Reich's final gambles in both East and West collided with a weapon born in an American laboratory, produced in factories scattered across Ohio and Maryland, and guarded with secrecy so tight most soldiers didn't even know its name. Invisible to the naked eye, the VT fuse met Hitler's last cards and cut them down. Historians still debate the tallies. Was the V1 kill rate truly 74%? Did Allied gunners fire 200,000 posite shells in the Ardennes? Were German December losses closer to 250 or 350 aircraft? The truth lies in ranges and estimates, not absolutes. Records burned in collapsing Reich archives, and wartime claims often inflated. But the broad picture is clear. The VT Fuse transformed anti-aircraft defense in both the skies of Britain and the snows of Belgium. The summer of 1944 showed its defensive power, turning the V1 from terror to nuisance. The winter of 1944 showed its battlefield utility, breaking the Luftwaffe's teeth in low-level attacks. Together, these campaigns proved the weapon's versatility. By early 1945, British and American commanders alike considered it indispensable. German leaders, once contemptuous of Allied science, now whispered that the enemy had filled the air itself with weapons. And as Alfred Jodel's bitter remarks suggested, the illusion of safety between bursts was gone. For the Luftwaffe, every second aloft carried the risk that a shell would sense their presence and explode. Direct private breathing. A woman soldered a vacuum tube the size of her fingertip, destined to survive 20,000 Gs. War-winning weapons were supposed to come from generals' strategy tables or scientists' equations, but in the case of the VT Fuse, victory was assembled on factory floors by ordinary Americans who never saw combat. Each shell's brain, a miniature circuit built from glass, wire, and solder, passed through the hands of women in smocks, men hunched over benches, and inspectors with magnifying glasses. Every unit had to survive the shock of being hurled from a naval gun at supersonic speed. If it didn't, lives would be lost at sea. By the end of the war, they had produced an astonishing 22,073,481 Fuzes. To the workers, each was just another shift's quota. To sailors and Marines, they were the difference between survival and destruction. The task of turning TUV's fragile prototypes into a mass-produced weapon fell to America's industrial base. The Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, under Vannevar Bush, parceled out contracts to some of the nation's most capable companies. The Crosley Corporation of Ohio became the lead manufacturer, but it was hardly alone. Sylvania, Eastman Kodak, RCA, McQuay Norris, and dozens more formed a secret consortium. In total, more than 2,000 suppliers fed into the program, employing 100,000 workers spread across the country. Factories that once made radios or cameras were retooled for war. Vacuum tubes were shrunk to thimble size, metal casings precision machined, and circuits ruggedized to survive launch accelerations exceeding 20,000 Gs. By 1944, the numbers staggered. America's plants were turning out 70,000 fuses every day, a torrent of electronics unmatched by any other nation. Each one cost between $18.00 and $25.00, making it far more expensive than a simple mechanical fuse. But the math was simple. One proximity shell that destroyed a kamikaze saved a ship, its crew, and its cargo. The value was beyond calculation. Workers were told almost nothing. Boxes were labeled "POSIT," and the devices themselves were explained only as special fuses. Crews soldered, assembled, and packed with no idea that their handiwork would soon be bursting beside Japanese Zeros and German V1S. The government guarded the program with ruthless secrecy. FBI agents monitored the factories, warning workers never to discuss what they made. Security checks were constant. In some plants, even casual sketches of the fuse were forbidden. Stories spread of unexploded shells being recovered at sea by sailors who had no idea what they were holding. Training manuals ordered that intact rounds be retrieved at all costs. A single fuse falling into enemy hands could unravel years of secrecy. Despite the scope of the operation, hundreds of thousands of people involved, no serious leaks occurred. The weapon remained unknown to Germany and Japan until after the war. Among the thousands of anonymous workers, some names surfaced in history. Workers and specialists across firms like Crosley, Sylvania, RCA, and Eastman Kodak built the Fuze's miniature electronics in absolute secrecy. Admiral William Blandy, who had championed the weapon at the Bureau of Ordnance, visited factories to stress its importance. Vannevar Bush, in his quiet way, reminded government overseers that these production lines represented not just labor, but the fusion of science and industry on a scale never attempted before. On the other side of the Atlantic, German flak crews still loaded the feared 88mm gun. It was deadly in reputation, capable of downing Allied bombers or piercing the armor of a Sherman tank. Yet its shells were dumb iron, bursting only where a mechanical fuse decreed. The contrast was stark. Germany fielded a weapon that inspired dread but offered no surprises. America fielded shells with tiny brains, invisible to the eye yet lethal in the sky. The irony was not lost on later historians. Housewives who had never seen the ocean were effectively building the Navy's most secret shield. High school graduates on assembly lines, radio technicians repurposed for war, and women who once stitched clothing now soldered circuits. They carried in their hands a secret weapon that the enemy never even suspected. Some workers described the monotony, endless repetition of solder joints, tube checks, resistance tests. Yet those same workers unknowingly gave fleet gunners the precision edge that saved thousands of lives. 22,073,481 Fuzes produced by V.J. Day. 70,000 per day in late 1944-45. 2,000 plus suppliers, 100,000 workers involved. $18.00 25 Fuzes on average. All under FBI watch, with no leaks to the Axis. Each number tells the same story, an industrial miracle disguised in small packages. After the war, headlines dubbed them radar shells. The phrase was catchy but misleading. They weren't radar in the sense of full tracking sets. Instead, they carried a tiny radio transmitter and receiver, tuned to sense reflections from a nearby target. When the signal peaked, the fuze fired. It was simple in concept, complex in execution, and revolutionary in practice. The myth of miniature radars inside every shell missed the truth. They were something stranger, an invisible field of detection shrunk into a handful of components. What made the VT Fuze extraordinary wasn't just its battlefield effect. It was how seamlessly it tied scientists and workers together. TÜV's laboratory breakthroughs could have remained curiosities. Instead, Crosley and its partners scaled them to millions. The story of the Fuze is as much about production lines as about physics. In a war often remembered for generals and admirals, it was the unseen hands of ordinary people that built the shield overhead. Here was the irony. In the age of titanic battleships and roaring aircraft carriers, one of the most decisive weapons of the war was built not on slipways, but on assembly lines. Housewives and factory hands, soldering and testing in secret, carried victory in their fingertips. No monument marks their labor. Yet every kamikaze shattered mid-dive, every V-1 destroyed over Kent, every convoy saved from bombers, traced back to those factories. By August 1945, America had not only supplied its fleets but also stockpiled millions more. When Japan surrendered, warehouses still bulged with crates of posite fuses, sealed with warnings that would no longer matter. The weapon had already done its work. "We believed their shells could see us," recalled a Japanese veteran in 1965. For most of the Pacific War, Japanese aviators had flown with a measure of confidence against American anti-aircraft fire. Flak might rattle cockpits, blacken the horizon, or rip holes in a wing, but it was something to be endured, not feared. Pilots trained to dodge, weave, and trust that the bursts would miss. By 1945, that confidence was gone. Veterans remembered a different sky, one where bursts seemed to anticipate their moves. A diary captured on Okinawa in April 1945 recorded a chilling line: "Flak bursts follow us like hunters." What had once been noisy but survivable had become lethal, and pilots began to whisper that the Americans had given their shells eyes. The numbers behind this shift were undeniable. Analysts estimated that by war's end, thousands of Japanese aircraft had been lost to anti-aircraft fire, with 5-inch VT-fused bursts responsible for a major share of late-war shootdowns. Some were destroyed by machine guns and light cannons, but the greatest share fell to 5-inch batteries armed with the new Fuzes. Scientist Vannevar Bush, reflecting later, claimed that the proximity fuse made 5-inch AA 7 times more effective. The ratio turned Flak from nuisance into decisive defense. Task force after task force reported attackers broken apart before reaching their dives. For pilots, this meant the training they had relied upon no longer worked. Rolling dives, sudden climbs, and erratic jinks, all were met by shells that seemed to wait until the aircraft was at its most vulnerable. The result was a slow erosion of morale, one diary entry at a time. The timing could not have been worse for Japan. At the war's outset, pilots endured a grueling pipeline, 700 flight hours before they entered combat. By 1945, the shortage of fuel, instructors, and aircraft meant some new aviators logged fewer than 100 hours before being thrown into action. The combination was devastating. Inexperienced pilots, already fragile, faced an American defense system now armed with what they believed to be supernatural weapons. Rumors circulated that the shells contained homing devices or magnets. Fear amplified their inexperience. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, head of the Japanese Combined Fleet, pushed his commanders to continue kamikaze waves, but even in suicide missions, men had to reach their targets. More and more were burning in the air long before impact. In the United States, another figure symbolized the strange overlap of technology and bravery, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, Medal of Honor recipient and Navy ace. O'Hare was killed in November 1943 during one of the Navy's earliest radar-selected night fighter operations from carriers. His loss underscored the risks of innovation, yet O'Hare's name lived on in Navy lore as proof that the fleet was willing to gamble both men and machines to change the odds. By 1945, the gamble had paid off. The same VT fuses tested in O'Hare's era were now commonplace across the U.S. Fifth Fleet, providing an invisible shield for every carrier and battleship. Captured documents reveal how German and Japanese pilots processed the new threat. Luftwaffe veteran Karl Bauer described low-level runs in the Ardennes where bursts detonated so close that their shells reached us without touching us. Japanese diaries from Okinawa echoed the same dread. The black bursts walked toward us. In both theaters, the pattern was the same. Where once skill and courage could outwit the mathematics of Flak, now it seemed that no maneuver was safe. The enemy believed that American shells had gained sentience. After the war, historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, tasked with writing the official U.S. naval history, gave the proximity fuse unusual prominence. He credited it as decisive to fleet survival, a rare admission that technology, not just strategy, had turned the tide. Morrison noted that without the fuse, kamikaze waves at Okinawa might have exacted double the losses. U.S. Navy analysts came to the same conclusion. Reports estimated that without the VT fuse, Okinawa losses would likely have doubled, meaning not 36 ships sunk, but perhaps 70. Not 4,900 sailors dead, but closer to 10,000. The numbers were grim even as they stood. With old fuses, the campaign might have become untenable. The war in the skies revealed a deeper contrast. American forces increasingly trusted electronics, from radar-setted fighter vectors to VT-fused shells. The fleet leaned on circuits and vacuum tubes. Japan, by contrast, leaned on spirit. Pilots were drilled to believe in Bushido, in the moral power of courage and sacrifice. Courage could help them press home attacks, but it could not stop a shell that sensed their presence and detonated before they could complete their dive. The battlefield was no longer a contest of nerves alone, it was a contest of physics. The irony was bitter. The Empire had told its young men that sheer will could defeat an industrial superpower, and yet those same men were falling to devices smaller than a matchbox, circuits built by women in Ohio and Maryland who never saw combat. Faith and fire met in the skies of Okinawa, and faith burned. In post-war interviews, Japanese veterans returned again and again to the subject of American flak. They remembered its density, its persistence, but, above all, its uncanny accuracy. One veteran, interviewed in 1965, summed up the sentiment, "We believed their shells could see us." It was not an exaggeration. To men who had once laughed at American gunnery, the shift was almost supernatural. Morale did not collapse in a single day. It ebbed raid by raid, pilot by pilot. By August 1945, the Imperial Navy's air arm no longer believed it could protect Japan's shores. Later commentators sometimes claimed that the VT Fuze shortened the war by 6 months. It is a tempting headline, but not one that Morrison himself ever wrote. The estimate came from broader post-war analyses, not a single authoritative source. The truth is simpler. The weapon ensured that American fleets could survive long enough to deliver their crushing offensives. Without it, losses might have slowed or even stalled the advance across the Pacific. Wars are fought with machines, but won with confidence. By 1945, Japanese and German pilots had lost faith in their ability to evade American fire. Allied crews, in turn, had gained the assurance that their shells mattered. That psychological shift was as important as the mechanical one. When the enemy no longer trusts the sky to protect him, his spirit is already broken. Over 22 million Fuzes built, more than any guided weapon of the war. Wars leave behind monuments of stone and steel. The VT Fuze left none. It was too small, too secret, and too humble for statues. Yet by August 14, 1945, the United States had built 22,073,481 of them, more units than any other guided weapon of the Second World War. Each was a miniature paradox, a brain the size of a thimble, made by workers who rarely knew its purpose, sent halfway across the globe to decide battles in seconds. When the war ended, America stood victorious. The Fuzes, built at a cost of over $1 billion, 0 cents wartime dollars, were stacked in warehouses, silent, their work already finished. The secrecy surrounding the Fuze was so complete that even many officers who had used the shells didn't know why they worked. Only after Japan's surrender did the truth emerge. In a September 1945 address, President Harry Truman revealed the weapon to the public, calling it one of the 3 great scientific developments of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. For the first time, sailors who had fired posite rounds learned that they had been wielding one of America's most tightly guarded secrets. The astonishment was widespread. The statistics, once classified, now astonished even hardened strategists. 22,073,481 Fuzes produced. A total cost exceeding $1 billion, 0 cents. Credited with destroying thousands of enemy aircraft. To the defense against hundreds of V-1 flying bombs, known to only a small fraction of U.S. personnel during the war. The arithmetic confirmed what sailors already suspected. The strange new bursts in the sky had been decisive. The principle of the VT Fuze detonation triggered by radio proximity was simple, but in practice it had revolutionized warfare. For centuries, artillery had relied on impact or time. Now it relied on sensing. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, writing his volumes on the U.S. Navy in World War II, gave the Fuze a rare emphasis. He concluded that without it, American fleets might not have survived the kamikaze gauntlet. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, was equally blunt. The weapon had transformed naval defense. Yet even as the weapon triumphed, it was already on the edge of obsolescence. Jet aircraft were arriving, bombers flew higher and faster, guided missiles, Germany's V-2S, and America's experiments hinted at the next battlefield. Anti-aircraft guns, no matter how smart their fuses, would not dominate the skies of the jet age. Here lay the contrast. AA guns faded after 1945, but the fuze's principle endured. Its descendants lived on in surface-to-air missiles, interceptor rockets, and even space systems. One of the fuze's alumni, James Van Allen, worked on the program as a young physicist. A decade later, he was pioneering America's space science, discovering the radiation belts that still bear his name. The leap was not coincidence. The same mastery of miniature electronics that allowed a fuse to survive gunfire also allowed satellites to survive the vacuum of space. In that sense, the VT fuse was a bridge. It linked the laboratories of wartime urgency to the laboratories of the Cold War, where the United States would compete not just for air superiority, but for the heavens themselves. Archives from the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory reveal the meticulous logs of tests, production quotas, and failure rates. Truman's speeches confirmed the scale of the effort. Naval Historical Center files chronicled its impact. Ship after ship saved. Pilot after pilot lost faith in evasive maneuvers. The record is clear. Without the fuze, the U.S. would have lost more carriers, more transports, more lives. With it, the Navy sustained its tempo, pushing relentlessly toward Japan. Looking back, the irony is overwhelming. Japan's pilots had once laughed at American flak, describing it as noisy but harmless. By 1945, they feared it more than fighters. The nation that believed spirit could defeat machines was undone by a device invisible to the eye, built by workers far from the battlefield. A small brain in a steel shell became the ancestor of missile guidance. The kamikaze's body could not outfly it. The V-1's engine could not outrun it. When the war ended, the VT fuse quietly slipped from headlines. The atomic bomb cast a longer shadow, radar was celebrated for its role in victory, and the proximity fuse became a technical footnote. Yet its legacy endures in every missile that detonates when near a target, in every interceptor that shatters an incoming warhead before impact. For the men who faced kamikazes, it was no footnote. It was the margin of survival. Japanese pilots once mocked American flak as wasteful and harmless. By 1945, they were dying in skies turned into electric fences, built not from walls of steel, but from the invisible pulses of millions of tiny circuits.